Everyone, first of all, thank you all for coming out here tonight. For those of you guys that I don't know, my name is Aiden Johnson. I'm a sophomore in the college, and I'm an associate member of the Lecture Fund. We're really excited for tonight's event, but before we get going, there are a few things that I want to cover. The first, I want to start off, like we do with most of our lectures, with our free speech and expression policy. So just bear with me and bear this in mind as the night goes on. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the maximum exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speakers, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respect the right of the speakers and the organizing student groups to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the night's activities. At the conclusion of this event, there will be a question and answer section during which you may ask questions that engage in dialogue. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question, and in the interest of time, we ask that you ask only one question. With that out of the way, I want to say thank you to a bunch of people who have helped this become possible. First of all is the rest of the Lecture Fund. They've been really instrumental in getting this night together. And then all of our co-sponsors as well. The Hoya, the Black Student Alliance, the Jewish Student Association, and the Students of Color Alliance. And finally, one other person I want to thank is Eli Saslow, who is the reporter at the Washington Post who wrote the story that got me first acquainted with Derek Black's story. He really said that he couldn't really imagine a better place for this to be going on, and he regrets that he couldn't be here tonight. And finally, I want to thank Dr. Chatelain and Derek for being so brilliant throughout this entire process. One of the goals of the Lecture Fund is to bring conversations to campus that the student body thinks are important and necessary. And I know I'm speaking for a lot of the people in this room and a lot of the people outside of it when I say that we are really thankful at how open, gracious, and willing you guys have been to be here tonight. So with all that in mind, I'm going to pass the mic off to Rabbi Rachel, who's going to make a few opening comments. Thank you guys all for coming. We're looking forward to a great night.
Ask me how I got this, I'll make up a great story. I am so humbled and honored to even be here, and I'll be very, very brief. When I heard about this incredible conversation that was about to happen, the Lecture Fund reached out to invite me. I was so moved to be asked to come. I said, please, can I say something? And here's why. You know, I get a lot of emails that say, Rabbi, you should read this, and Rabbi, you should read that, and do you know you should read this and you should read this? And I kind of do, it's kind of like the thing when someone when my parents said to me in high school, you know, your aunt knows this boy who you might want to meet. When you move to Washington, you should find this guy to be friends with. Yeah, okay, thanks a lot, right? And then you don't do anything about it. But on October 15th this past year, my inbox was flooded. It was flooded by members of the Jewish community and other folks from across the country and said, you might be interested, you should read this. I said, okay, well, all right. I better pay attention here, and I opened it. It was the article in the Post that we were just referencing before about Derek and his relation and his journey and the role that the Jewish community played in that journey. And I wept, and I just wept. I wept because I was amazed, once again, that when the common good is the goal or is looming somewhere, this incredible power that comes from somewhere that allows us to pivot towards it. I wept because of the unbelievable strength and determination and humility that it took for a young man to do what he did, for Derek to put himself in the situation that he did, to expose himself to people and views that were so different from his, who he never met. I wept for that strength and that blessing. I wept because as a Jew, I know the danger that speaking in echo chambers to people who only think the way we do can have. And for that echo chamber for someone from one side to another side, from another place, to break through those walls in a way that honors the other is such a powerful story that I believe is the hope of our future. So thank you for modeling this for us. And my prayer I won't pray because I think this is a non-sectarian moment, but my prayer is that we are inspired and learn from this story to take it with us when we leave and replicate it in our lives as much as we possibly can. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Marcia Chatelain and Derek Black.
Hi, folks. Is this thing on? No? Hi, folks. Thank you for coming tonight and just listening in on a conversation that I hope you find as meaningful as I did in the preparation for this. And I just want to say one thing very quickly. A couple of weeks ago, a group of faculty came together with graduate students and undergrads and people from the community to do a teach-in about our political moment. And it was really gratifying to see the people turn out for it. In that process, someone, whether it's a student or a community visitor, took some video of the faculty and put it on a website that I think is just devoted to trolling. And so if anyone in this audience has that impulse, I just ask that you really think about that choice, because the spirit of this conversation tonight is really an opportunity for people to grow together. And so I just want to ask that if that is your inclination. And with that, welcome you, Derek, to Georgetown.
Thank you, Dr. Chatelain. It's very nice to be here. It's the first time I've ever been on the campus. It's beautiful. It's very great. And thanks for inviting me.
You were telling me that you were visiting some monuments as well?
Yeah, I did last night. A friend from New College, actually, who lives up here. We walked around all the different monuments and saw them at night. It was super nice. Very nice. I've been to DC a bunch of times, but never actually made the circuit in the dark. I think we were the only two people at most of the places, and considering the current climate, it felt weird. It felt like this is some sort of American sacred space and something strange is happening. It's the two of us looking at it, and I think I'm going to look back on last night actually as a new period or something.
Well, since you brought it up, let's talk about this climate. And for many of us in the audience, we're familiar with your journey. But one of the questions that I was really curious about, at what age did you realize the types of groups and politics that your family held? Do you remember when you kind of realized what what nationalist movement was about?
I mean, I don't think there's a one period. I think it's something that you grow up with, and I think there's a lot of times that I would parallel with this analogy. So it's probably good to have it in the beginning. That I think myself, and there are other children who grow up in white nationalism. It's not an unusual thing, actually, and I knew most of them because it's a very tight-knit little community. It's most similar to growing up in a religious tradition. There are beliefs, and there are things that you believe that the rest of the world doesn't believe. There's evangelizing when people go out and have a protest. It's very similar to the impulse to teach other people. I think the harder thing to understand is that I don't think anybody that I was close to feels that they were being malicious. They think that they're the only people who know this very important truth, and that they're called to spread that. And when you grow up with that, there are most people who did not become as big of spokesmen, as big of activists as I was. They still quietly live with the fact that they know this truth, and they're going to teach their kids, and they're going to live with that forever, and they feel like they're a part of a special group who knows something. And I think it's most close out of anything to growing up in some religious tradition.
And the distinction you make between the people who they learn this stuff and they still operate in the world, so much of your experience was a kind of isolation in it because you were so big in it. Did you ever feel like you had to keep it a secret from certain people?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember talking to Eli, who wrote the story, and he had a very similar question, and he was because there's the story of when I go to new college and the first semester that I was there, I didn't tell anybody about this because obviously this is not going to go down well. And that was not the first time in my life. I've lived my entire life that way. There were two different worlds. There was the one where you're doing this thing, and then there was the other where you're not denouncing it, you're not rejecting it. If somebody calls you on it, you have to speak truth. But you don't have to bring it up because that's something that you can leave somewhere else. And I don't know if everybody experienced it that way, but that was definitely my life from a little child on. There were people who I would interact with. I'd go to classes or something. I was in school up until 3rd grade and then homeschooled, and after that I didn't withdraw from the world, but there would be situations I'd be in for quite a while, and then inevitably people find out what my family did, and then later on what I was saying, and then there's always this break. And so I experienced that break over and over and over again, where I was involved in something, people discover it, I believe it's true, so I choose what is the most important truth in my family's life, and then you're essentially done with that thing and move on to the next thing. That's the story of my life. Is a lot of experiences, and the new college is like a culminating experience of larger outrage than I had ever experienced before.
So this experience of like hiding something and then the exposure, as a kid, did it also make you feel really afraid of the world? Because it seems like so much of this ideology is about being afraid of people who are different, right? And so in your kind of daily life, going to the supermarket, going to the movies, and seeing different groups of people, did that ever create any anxiety or fear about being just in the world?
No, actually. I think it's almost the opposite. It's when you are sure, and I should say when I and other people around are absolutely sure that we all know how the world works, know the real thing about how the world works, and everything makes sense. Why we went into Iraq is like an anti-Semitic thing, and why people act the way they do, it all makes sense, and you have everything figured out, and you just need to make sure that other people figure it out too, and they're going to reject it, but you're right. And I think that makes it easier to go into the world because I know everything.
Yeah. And that kind of certainty that you carried with you, it led you to, as a teenager, to become very vocal as part of the white nationalist movement. And I think one of the things that struck me in the article was that you kind of had a public presence as a teenager. They said you had given interviews about it. And
yeah, even before that, when I was starting in like 8 or 9 or something, I gave interviews with all these international news things. I was in the USA Today and Dateline, and Linda Ellerby, Nick News had a special on me, and so I very much grew up with the press and talking to reporters.
And I imagine that some of this press wasn't positive.
None of it was positive.
And so you're a 9-year-old, you're a 10-year-old, and there is this incredible machinery that is critiquing you. So what you're saying is that this ideology is so powerful that even at that age, it didn't like disturb you a little bit?
No. This is one of the things that I ponder when I'm looking back on my life, because in a lot of ways, my motivations and who I am, it doesn't feel dramatically different from any other point. Why I want to do things is essentially the same. And so I do look back and wonder why I didn't find it more upsetting. I think, go back to the religious tradition, and to clarify, no white nationalists would agree with like, oh, it's a religious tradition. They use like it's a political hard fact thing. This isn't belief. And when I was convinced that it was right, and not only right, but really had to be acted on, or else everything was going to fall apart, then everybody in the world being wrong didn't matter that much.
And as you got older, and one of the things that I wonder about as a young man being in this kind of ideology, how much did that shape ideas about violence or about acting out these things physically? I'm curious if that was also part of the indoctrination.
I think it probably made it easier for me when I was younger, because there was never any violence around me. There was never anybody doing anything illegal or violent. What I grew up with was going to conferences and hearing people talk about IQ differences between African countries and European countries, and look at these statistics, this is so right, and people who correctly would point out historical facts and say, look, the founders were super racist, so they're so smart, and it was this sort of like pseudo-intellectual thing, and no, I was aware that the news presented it as violent. I knew there were people who my dad knew who had done violent things, but it was, everybody around him was old by that point, so that was their crazy youth, and that wasn't the future for me. It was, everything I did was political, it was all, you know, debate, it was civil, and anybody who wasn't willing to have a pleasant conversation about this was some kind of irrational radical or something. And I always viewed it as really, like, I don't know, really civil discourse-y. Like, even if, when I was a little kid, this is the kind of thing we sit down and we talk about, and I don't know why people react so strongly to this. It's, you know, they just need to hear it.
It's incredible because if you look at the history of the KKK, there's a moment where they rebrand themselves, right, as a civilized organization of intellectuals.
Yeah, I know the people who did that.
Well, there you go. And in doing that, right, I think it bumps up against what we see right now when we talk about normalization. And what I think a lot of us could describe as gaslighting. When a person is saying, well, this is a problem, well, what problem? And so all of this kind of leads you to a path of an intellectual process, and you go to New College of Florida. It's a small liberal arts college in Sarasota. And what is it like to then find yourself away from home in this new environment that is very much challenging your thinking?
At first, no different from any time.
Okay.
I mean, at first, and people here are wrong, like they're wrong in lots of places. This is a bastion of liberalism, and there were some things about me when I showed up that were probably more conducive to liberal ideas than other more conservative people. I showed up thinking abortion was fine, important even, and I was perfectly fine with LGBT issues, and they're like things like this that are probably not always the case for white nationalists, but so I was able to agree with people on that, and even though they didn't know my background, was able to interact with them on that front. And no, at first I was just, they're wrong, there is facts, race is real, and white people are threatened and all this other stuff, and this is a nice place. I'd go sailing, I'd go to classes, and it really wasn't particularly challenging at first, which is quite interesting, because this is a central place where social justice was absolutely the culture. It's the sort of place where a liberal would show up and say, wow, I am not very far left. And is that here too?
No comment.
And so it should have probably been more challenging, and I think if I'm interested in introspective, how did I change my mind, considering I thought I was so rational and everything I thought made so much sense, it was so backed up, I was clearly not engaging with it until later on. That first semester, before I ended up taking a second semester abroad, when people discovered who I was, and it happened when I wasn't around. The first semester didn't challenge my own personal views at all.
What was that like when you went on a message board? It seems like there was some internal internet thing.
Yeah, there was an email forum at the school. Since there's only 800 students in the school, at that point, every student was automatically added to the email listserv, and any message you send goes to all 800 students.
So did an individual student realize who you were and then sent it to everyone?
Yeah, one particular student who was an upper year.
I would have done something like that. I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to say that out loud. I was like, oh, that would have been me in college. What is that feeling like?
Oh, that's a sinking feeling. But I knew it was going to happen, so I guess a relief at some point. I emailed people who I knew from back home who knew all the controversy in my little campaign that I ran, and all my stuff that had happened before I ever went to New College back on the other side of the state. And I would be texting with them and saying, wow, this place is not going to like this eventually. And so being not there and this email appearing was definitely a sinking feeling, because there's lots of people who I was friends with who I never told this, never told them at all. They had no idea. They found it out in this 800 post forum thread, and it was one of the cruelest things I've ever done to people, is making deep friendships with people and not revealing that, and then having them find out by email, and that was hard.
As you were making these friendships, and that's so much the focus of the article, about the capacity of these friendships to help you change, what was your kind of rationale that you felt like you could connect to a person you might have framed as an enemy or deficient in one way, but still remain committed that this is what the path you were supposed to be on? How did you reconcile those experiences?
The difference, I reconciled it by saying that individuals are one thing, and individuals can exist in any space and situation. You relate with them in a certain way. Masses of people are a totally different dynamic, and what might be true for individuals is not necessarily true for masses, which is something that unraveled fairly quickly, because there's no dichotomy here. there's no difference between masses and individuals, and you can't say, well, no, all these individuals are fine. It's just when there's a million people that we have problem, and this is the sort of conversation that I ended up having. But yeah, I could be friends with anyone. It was not. So
your exposure, you were abroad, and you had a choice whether to return to the school or start over somewhere else. Why did you return to New College?
It was an excellent school. It was the classes were fantastic. I had a very pleasant first semester. I really liked being there, even if I was terrified of it at that point. And I don't think I would have quit something like that. It would have felt like I was failing or something. It absolutely did not intend to change my mind. I thought about maybe bringing in a speaker or something when I showed up, when I got back.
What kind of speaker?
There are people, most of them who live in DC, who do this kind of like race realist science-y thing.
Can I just tell you, as I'm having this conversation, I think other people are feeling this way. There's this weird way where, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, that this is not that weird. To have everyday people that you interact with who are devoted to this ideology, who have a speakers bureau and lovely conferences that are like among us, right? And that everyone can be fine and pleasant. I mean, I think that there's a fantasy that this is all intimidation and violence, but a lot of this is very normal behavior. But it's hidden.
Especially when you're in the midst of it, yes.
Yeah.
I shouldn't name drop her, but I think she'll be all right. After Eli's story, I ended up getting in touch with Megan Phelps-Roper, who is the granddaughter of the founder of the Westboro Church, and there's no white nationalist and no Westboro person would ever say, oh, like very similar ideologies. They would feel like absolutely different. The other one's insane. And we started sharing these experiences because she grew up in it. She was became more active than any other kid in her group who grew up in it. Trying to come up with rational arguments to convince other people they were right, getting rejected, appearing in the news, and we started going over and we were just like, wow, this is exactly the same experience. And we had the same thing. When Westboro people hang out, it's very cordial most of the time. There's things over there for whatever. But when everybody gets together and they all believe the same thing, it's so binding that the world is wrong and thinks we're wrong, but when you're in the same room, it's recharging, right? That's what happens in these things.
So at some point you decide to share with the Southern Poverty Law Center a statement that you wrote, and the article captures that moment. Can you kind of bring us back to that moment where you decide to make a statement about your family ties and your ideology and your shift?
Okay, it was a long run up to that. It's about 2 years between coming back to New College and thinking, oh, I should bring some speaker from one of these like race realist think tanks in DC, to saying that would be unpleasant for these people and why would I do that to them, and realize it ended up going to Matthew Stephenson's Shabbat, which I'd been friends with him first year. And people who have read the super long story will know all these things, and Matthew and I never spoke about it
But he knew.
Oh, absolutely, he knew. But he wasn't in a position to say, oh, these terrible things. Why do you say these bad things about Jews? Like,
so this is fascinating to me.
We would talk about everything. We talk about science and history, and it was other people at Shabbat, and generally people who were not minorities who could come at me and without having to have this like privileged dynamic thing, who could say like, that sucks what you're saying. And at the same time, I could say, well, you're so smart and I trust you and I like you. Why do you think that sucks?
So do you think that you needed to hear whites resist you first?
I think so. I had heard whites resist me. I needed to hear whites who I trusted and liked and knew that I wanted to know what they thought. And it sounds quite harsh, but I suspect at the time, no matter how much I respected a person of color, I don't think that it would have worked. I think it took a bridge.
I think that's important to think about in terms of ways that people show up for racial justice. I think especially in this moment, we talk so much about allyship and what does it mean to actually, stand up for something. And I'm incredibly curious about something that we talked about earlier today on the phone, and something that you wanted to say about the danger of suggesting that civil discourse is the only way to fight racism. Can you?
Yeah, I think Eli wrote a brilliant story, and I talked to him about it even when it came out. People who were at New College and people who are aware of social justice are aware of the danger when the public and typically privileged people start talking about how you need to have like a nice conversation and you should be super respectful and that's the only way you'll change minds. And then you read this long story, and I think I've seen people on the internet post and say like, oh, civil discourse wins the day. People, you just need to go to school and it'll all be good. And that is not the lesson here. I mean, it's important to ally and talk to people and not give people like I was an inch. But the only reason that happened is because it was the biggest uproar I've ever seen in my life. There was this moment where I had all these breaks in life, but then I got to this point where I had to come back, and it was a tiny community, and I knew so many people there, and I had to engage with it, and they were terrified, they were opposed to it, obviously, and I never would have started those conversations with the people, the quiet ones, where like, oh, I trust you, why do you think this? If there hadn't been hundreds of people who were saying this is absolutely unacceptable. And I really want to make sure that that's the lesson. It's not this like, oh, just be respectful. And
in terms of thinking about, the culture of campuses, today I read an article that a University of Wisconsin student who's been advocating for an alt-right organization, it's been revealed that he had 2 prior convictions for arson at African-American churches. And one of the things that article made me think about is the radicalization of white men on the internet. When we look at people like Dylan Roof and that kind of content, and in terms of your perspective about how the internet provides this space for young white men to enter domestic terrorism, essentially, what do we do as a community? I mean, there's nothing, it feels like there's nothing we can do on that space, but what are some of the interventions that you think could be helpful?
that is a difficult question.
You don't have to answer. That's my professor question.
I can only give you my experiences. I can't give, any sort of like, oh, what do we do about like the fake news? But I grew up getting reaffirmation on what I believed as a kid from my family in these larger conference communities. Nobody lived nearby. I was always going to things, and I got them from the internet. I would go on chat rooms every night and talk to people from all over the world. Some of them were quite young, some were quite old, and we all believed that the white race was in danger globally, and you could have these little communities online. And I suspect that's happening now, even though social media makes it different. The internet of the 90s was a very different world than it is now. But I don't know how anyone could have impacted those little communities we had. If somebody had shown up and said, this is where, you know, we fight the fascists or something, we would have banned them and then gone back to chatting. And it would have reaffirmed, there is an opposing views section on Stormfront, on the website my dad starts, and that's not some allowance, you know, it's framed as, and in a situation where it's not a public shouting match, then a personal relationship is a personal relationship. The net doesn't make it not real, so.
And part of part of your story that I think is important to also talk a little bit about is the sense of loss that you've also experienced in making this choice of disavowing these ideas, because it isn't just a set of ideas, it's friends, it's family, it's community. How do you grapple with the things that you've left behind?
For a long time, I tried to never look back, to just keep going forward, and I was somewhat reassured that the world was fine, and I would tell myself frequently that what I had advocated and what I was totally true, had been broken down bit by bit in all these private conversations, and now that was a huge regret, and was willing to accept that I had actually caused damage with this, and I didn't know what to do about that. But the world was moving in a fine direction, so I just tried to hang my head low and just never think about it. And for a long time, I didn't have much relationship with my family. I got disowned several times to begin with, and we do talk now. But I think there was a fairly alone period with myself. I ended up moving across the country. Most people around me didn't know my background. I never brought it up with anyone, falling back on that same thing that I had done my entire life, which only changed with this Washington Post article. I now live in a whole new era. Every day is a new experience where people are aware of this, and I don't have to tense as much.
Yeah. One of the things you also wrote about in the New York Times was watching the country after the election, and your reflections about how some of the rhetoric of white nationalism, how it surfaced into a mainstream form, whether it's alt-right or alternative facts or whatever garbage is being put out there. And so I wonder, in terms of kind of watching that unfold as you're kind of going through your personal journey, how does that feel like?
It's what influenced me to work with Eli to write the thing. He approached me in 2015, the end of the spring, and I did my usual hermit crab thing where I pulled away, and I initially didn't respond to him, so he found my landlord's phone number and called my landlord, and my landlord called me, and I was just did a freak out, and I emailed him. I was like, "Don't you dare, you know, you're getting in my life." And so that was 2015, and he said, "Okay, fine." Great guy, great friends with him now. But the year following that was the year of the guy, and it was summer of 2016 as we got back in touch, and the initial conversations were sort of that this is oddly reminiscent of what you wanted forever, right? Because there are old speeches of me talking about how the Republican Party is this primarily white party, and there's all this latent white racism in it, and you just need to get somebody who would like say it overtly, and the system is set up that people can vote for it, and they will, and so I've got these like prophetic sounding speeches, and so he reminded me that, oh, some of those things you advocated are like here, and he's reposting white genocide, which is something that I spread. I'm partly responsible for that being on Twitter, and he was retweeting some guy who had said that, and then Hillary gave her talk where she was essentially denouncing my childhood, but implying that it had national significance, and it was this freak out moment where I thought that I had left and my little tiny community lived in their little tiny community, and they had their little tiny conferences, and they still do have their little tiny conferences. I don't think they've gotten power, to be clear, but the ideas that motivate them and Trump voters are suddenly center stage, and people were talking back then and still are talking about how this, maybe we should actually debate this kind of stuff. Maybe America is changing for the worse, and they don't say race things, but it gets down to that's the difference between white nationalists and political discourse, is that they don't say white. Well, that was.
Can you say that again for the people in the back? No, I mean, I think that's exactly what makes this time so difficult, right? It is not 1968, but it sounds like 1968, and it might not be the stuff that was on Stormfront, but it feels, I mean, there's so much of it resonates. And for the people who are outside of white nationalism, right, for white people who are just good folks living their life, something about this is appealing, and I think it's victimization. I think it's really compelling. And in terms of watching kind of that landscape, for the people in this room who will never spend time within the white nationalist community, but has a grandparent, a parent, a cousin, a best friend who makes a comment, or who has something to say when they see groups of people of color, or has, this kind of impulse to listen to, what do you call him, that guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, him. What does resistance to that look like? Because on one hand, your story is so dramatic, and then there's something that's so chillingly relatable about it, for some.
I wonder how much what I experience is a relatable experience, because I had to publicly write a letter because I was a public spokesman for white nationalism, and I had my whole, going back to when I was 8 years old.
Yeah, that's different.
But I do have close friends who I watch in more subtle ways, where the things they post on Facebook, they post social justice articles on Facebook, and their mother or father, reads it because they're away from home, and then I've seen change in that way. And I can definitely say I relate with everybody who went to college and learned some stuff and then went home, and suddenly the things they hear their whole life, they now cringe. I can relate with that, so I can relate with everybody else. It's just, I don't know, I have to wonder whether what my loved ones are doing is damaging the nation more so than worry that Thanksgiving is going to be unpleasant.
That's very real. Considering so much of something that we talk about at Jesuit schools is formation, and so much of it is about kind of orienting yourself to your purpose and seeing yourself, in tune with kind of your internal process. As you kind of move through the world now, what do you think orients you?
I mean, it's relatively new for me to wonder that question, I think. And I have this unusual platform where I can write a New York Times op-ed and they say, oh, thanks. And most people don't have that. And so I think...
What was that? Oh, someone just brought you against the lights.
Okay.
Little skittish here. A different environment, folks. But we're good.
Okay. So
The question is, what orients you now?
I have a platform, and people will listen. Things when I was saying that I want to make sure that my story isn't taken as like a civil discourse, I think there are certain points that I can make more forcefully and surprisingly than people who have a different platform could, because I see people on the internet say, oh, civil discourse wins, and then I can shock them and say, absolutely not, and surprise them. And I think there are probably other situations where things that I experienced as the whole range of like how an argument affects you. It's that it's coming from somebody you know and trust. You have this rapport and trust and friendship with them, and then the intellectual side of realizing that things you believe forever are not true, and the things you've said are damaging. This sort of experience that I don't know, happens in other situations, but like happened to me in this particular situation, I think it maybe equips me to point out things that in some ways are like tenets of white nationalism, and in others are tenets of American society. Like white nationalism, it's not strange in the context of America. The things that white nationalists...
Say that again.
Like it's the whole system of race is that motivates white nationalists is the same system that motivates candidates and systems and where the money goes and all these sort of things. And I don't necessarily, while white nationalists don't realize the damage that race does, they don't understand privilege, they don't know what that means. I think there's a ton of people who don't understand what privilege means and how race impacts the world. And because I have this crazy extreme situation where like, oh man, you're like a white supremacist and now you realize it's wrong, it's so extreme that for some reason people want to listen to it. And I think that the hook at the end that I can do is saying, well, actually, you know, what motivated me is inside you. And then they go like, oh, you know, I'm not totally fine. And I think there's possibility there with this thing that I have now where I can say stuff sometimes. So I'm trying to figure out how to do it.
I'm going to wrap this up so we can ask questions, but I have two questions for you. First, how do you think of, in terms of responsibility or atonement? And considering all that you've been through, how do you trust people?
I think I trust people more. The second question, I think I trust people more now than I used to, because I no longer have to wait for the break. When I make a friend now, I don't have to worry that they'll discover me and that it'll be over. So I'm much more open. And since October 15th, I've become much more open too. There was October 14th, I had a whole lot of friends who had no idea that this had ever happened. And October 16th, I had a whole lot of Facebook messages saying, glad you spoke up. And I talked to them for an hour, and people I never would have thought I would have. So I had a roommate for 3 years. He was my closest friend when I moved across the country. We hung out every day. We did projects, we did homework together, we worked together, we got drunk together, we did all the things. He found out from the Washington Post article. And I was worried that he was gonna say, oh no. And he said, like, why didn't you tell me like years ago? You know, and now we talk about it. So I think I trust people, I can trust more now. I think like my whole experience taught me to trust more than I did. In terms of like atoning though, there's a Catholic sentiment of atonement where...
Welcome to Georgetown.
I mean, I do study Catholic monasticism, so I end up reading these like long monastic theology things, and there are frequently moments where they're, you know, talking about sin and stuff like that, not to get too theological, and I'm not religious, but there are times where it feels like there's never a point where you're like, okay, you know, I fixed that, you know, I did a bad thing and now I like did a good thing. And so there's like a whole lifetime, I think, of I'm gonna do what I think is good. And I don't always trust myself anymore, because I used to know everything in the world, and anytime I get too sure of something, now I have to go like, why do I think that? And I get very suspicious when anyone else thinks they know everything, and it's totally changed how I view stuff. And I need to read more psychology because the stupid brain likes to believe stuff and think you know why you believe it. And so I'm a bit more suspicious, but a lot more trusting.
Thank you so much, Derek.
Thank
This is
you.
really lovely. Thank you.